Alright, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from Garage Art in Taos, New Mexico. 4th of July weekend. I just thought I'd do a pan around of the display we have out front and my sign for Garage Art. Before I hobble back in across the pointy rocks barefoot to show you what's going on today. Ouch, 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 ouch. Okay, we're good. Alright, so spent a little time today reorganizing stuff. I got this walkway clear and now the paintings are more clearly displayed. Got enough space now to walk easily between the stacks and thumb through stuff and have the display of the little things a little more well organized.
Because if you go back 2,500 years to the Buddha,
so if you need trinkets
the Buddha talked about what he called
or weird art,
interdependent co-arising
a Godzilla robot riding a skateboard,
arising relationship to every other phenomenon. You can't separate anything from anything else.
interesting board games,
And so contemplate the nature
Chinese
of
calligraphy set,
co-arising during every moment.
fantastic books,
Look at a leaf or a rainbow.
or anything else like that, big furniture, antiques, things like that. Also, we have them here. But today I am working on rupture of plane. Hopefully my tripod is still aimed good enough to pick up where I had it a moment ago. Alright, all of the glaze work is set. At least this layer. I don't know if I'm going to do another layer on top of this. I imagine not. So what I think I'm going to do now is start with the figure 2 upper medium left there and re-aura her, and then move over to figure 1, re-aura him, and then we'll start branching out with subtle highlighting on all of the rest of the figures from there. Here we go.
To which many factors contribute, but the psychological cannot be separated from the physical, and the physical and the psychological aspects of the individual cannot be separated from his or her social connections and existence, and therefore from the culture that they live in. And if we're going to be fully inclusive about human beings, I'll have to bring in another dimension, which of course is heresy in medical terms, which is the spiritual one. And so basically we're biopsychosocial spiritual creatures. And spiritual simply means that there's more to us than the little ego that many of us are hung up on and which rules this particular society. The second point I'm going to make for you is that disease is not a fixed entity, it's a process. And that process is not separated from that person's life. So that how the multiple sclerosis will behave is not simply a characteristic of the disease. It reflects what's happening in the life of that particular individual, which is, by the way, why we're seeing 3 times as much in women right now, which I'll talk about later. But it's a process. And if it's a process that somehow manifests how we're living our lives, then we can actually perhaps do something about it. And I'm not here trying to give you an alternative to Western medicine, which has many wonderful achievements to its credit and can perform miracles really, as we all know. But there's something missing. And what's missing is that we don't know from the Western medical perspective how to promote the healing process within the patient, himself or herself, or themselves. And from that perspective, illness is not just meant to be battled. It's meant to be come to terms with, understood, inquired into as to what its message is. And from that perspective, illness is a potential teacher. And that invites and actually necessitates an inquiry. Now let me give you another British medical fact. Stephen Hawking, the physicist who died, 2 years ago, in his mid-70s of ALS, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or known in Britain as motor neuron disease. Do you know he was diagnosed at age 20? You know how long he was given to live? 2 years. He should have died well over 50 years ago. Something didn't figure in the equation, did it? Otherwise he would have succumbed much longer. And many people do succumb, of course. But I know people like Hawking who have long survived ALS and have done even better than he did in terms of physical functioning. So the disease does not have a life of its own. It does manifest the life and functioning and social circumstances of the individual. Let me talk to you about another British person. I could talk to you about ALS as an interesting example, but I'll leave it for now. Let me come to multiple sclerosis. And there was a person who I was very interested in, because I'm a lover of classical music, and I'm very interested in the lives of musicians. And there was the great British cellist Jacqueline du Pré, who died of multiple sclerosis in her 40s. And I'm going to play a piece of music, actually, a couple of minutes of her recording of the Algar cello concerto. And I'm recalling now, so I may not be quoting it exactly, but it's a remarkable recording made, I think, when she was 21 or 20 years old. And her sister, Hilary, who was also a musician, not as gifted as Jackie was, said that Jackie's ability to capture the emotions of a man in the autumn of his life was one of her remarkable and inexplicable capacities. Well, it was remarkable, but it wasn't inexplicable. Now, Algar wrote this concerto in the aftermath of the First World War, and he was really despondent at the carnage. And he said at the time when he wrote this that everything nice and fresh and clean is far away, will never return. And Jackie looked at portraits of Algar, and it always made her sad, and she said to her sister Hilary, he had such a beautiful soul, and that's what I sense in his music. Now, when Jacqueline du Pré played the cello for audiences, when she came to Canada in Toronto, the audience cried. She was that moving in her performance, and when she was on stage, it's like a wall that always stood between her and other people, all of a sudden dissolved. And then she became vibrant, and her body moved around, and her long blonde hair swayed and flew in the air, and she just put so much emotion into her playing. So they called that her cello voice. But she was never able to express her emotions in real life. In fact, she tried to fit in just to be the person everybody wanted her to be. Her sister said that she was always the Jackie that circumstances demanded. Well, that's totally typical of everybody with multiple sclerosis. Why? And you might think at this point, well, she didn't actually want any more than King Albert wanted to become King George. No more than that did Jackie want to become a cello virtuoso. She envied somebody who gave up the cello. She said, I can't do it because people would be so disappointed in me. She said she actually was afraid that it would kill her. But it did. When she was 7 or 8 years old, I forget exactly, I read Hilary's account of this. She said that to her sister, Hil, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. That's exactly what happened by the time she was in her 30s. It's very interesting here because sometimes people have this intuitive feeling. Jonathan Swift, the great satirist and writer, author of Gulliver's Travels, who died with severe Alzheimer's dementia, said to a doctor friend of his as they were walking outside one day, looking at this tree losing its leaves, and Swift said, I shall be like that tree. I shall die first at the top. There's something in us that knows. Jacqueline Dupre went to Russia to study the cello, the land of music. She was raped there. She comes back to England and says to Hillary, Hillary, don't tell our mommy this, but I was raped in Russia. Now notice both times, don't tell our mommy this. She doesn't want to hurt the mummy's feelings or upset the mummy. And you might think at this point, I'm blaming her for the disease. I'm not blaming anybody for the disease because these patterns that I'm describing are not conscious on anybody's part. Nobody chooses them deliberately. But there's a sense, but there's a responsibility here. By responsibility, I don't mean in any sense guilt or blame. I mean in the sense that if you actually look at who gets sick and why, yes, there's certain patterns and dynamics, certain beliefs that they hold about themselves and their relationship to the world that actually, I'm not going to say causes the illness, but contributes significantly to the onset of the illness. And furthermore, there's another meaning to the word responsibility, responsible, which is response-able. We want people to be response-able. And I can tell you, I know people with multiple sclerosis who once they become response-able, once they look at the flare-ups and what stresses led to the flare-ups and how they unwittingly contributed to those stresses and learn how to prevent the next flare-up, their disease actually significantly mitigated. And that's what I mean by responsibility. I mean response-ability. So they had what Jackie called the cello voice, or was called her cello voice. Now in this particular recording, you'll hear that voice, but interestingly enough, there's another recording of the same concerto by Dupre some years later, which her sister heard after her sister's death. And it was the last recording made by Jacqueline Dupre in Britain before she could no longer play the cello. And as Hillary was listening to this recording, she said, suddenly, I stopped, she said, Jackie was slowing the tempo down. I knew what she was doing. She was speaking in her cello voice. She was playing her own requiem. Now the recording I'll play you now is the one that was made by the 21 or 20-year-old, excuse me a second here, Jacqueline Dupre.
Is there time? 15 minutes, not bad. Alright, I think I can wrap that around the rest of her arm and head in the next 10 minutes. So, cool.
I wish I could play a few more minutes of that, but we're just going to run out of time if I do. The question is, why do people do that? Why do they suppress themselves? Why do they try to please others? Why does she try to be the Jackie that circumstances demanded? This is where there's no blame whatsoever, because Jacqueline Dupre was born to a mother who was, while she was still in the hospital with her baby, lost her father, to whom she was very close. Jackie's mother's father died. The role that Jackie was thrust into as an infant was that of the mother's emotional support. She had no emotional existence of her own. these early relationships that we experience, they become our templates for our personalities, and they become the templates for how we interact with the world. And the key point here is that there are two basic needs that human beings have. One is for attachment. Now, attachment is absolutely essential for human survival. Attachment is actually a biological drive. It's an instinct to be close to another person. Why do we have that drive? Because without it, we can't survive. The human infant is the most helpless, most dependent, least capable creature in the universe. And so without an attachment drive that calls that infant to come close to the mother, to be taken care of, or to the father, to the parenting figures, and without an equivalent attachment drive on the part of the parenting figure to be close to the baby, there's no survival of the infant. Reptiles can get away with it, birds can't, mammals can't, and least of all can human beings. So the attachment drive is like a gravitational force that pulls two bodies together for the person of being taken care of, or to take care of the other. So that attachment drive is not negotiable. We can't survive without it, nor could we have survived as individuals as we evolved from our pre-hominid ancestors, and over millions of years, 100,000 of years, people had to attach to each other in small groups in order to survive. So that's just a basic need. But we have another need that's also important in the long term, and that need is for authenticity. And authenticity means knowing what you feel and your guts and being able to act on it. Now, as we evolve, now let me ask you a question. I'll ask again for a show of hands. Just please raise your hand if you've had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something, ignoring it, and being sorry afterwards. Just raise your hand. Well, again, that's how important it is. That's how important it is. And when you think of human evolution, or think of any animal out there in the wild today, just how long does an organism, a creature, survive out there in the wild if they're not in touch with their gut feelings? So we have these two important needs: attachment and authenticity.
All right, that gets her squared up.
All to the self, being in touch with ourselves.
Back up.
Now,
I'm going to use a pure out of the tube Van Gogh titanium white.
You're 2 years old.
For the re-highlights, so they'll be extremely vivid and have a nice glow to them, as that one does.
And then you get the message.
Yes.
Those little kids don't get angry.
All right, so
you might even be punished.
I'm going to zoom in on this guy and cut it here.
Jordan Peterson.
Take this up in a few minutes.
Canadian.
There we go.
So-called psychologist. Says that an angry child should be made to sit back.
The breakdown of
Right,
medieval society and the rise of mercantilism generated a need to cast back into time for a set of values and then to realize them. And the period of time that was chosen was classical Greece and Rome. And so painting, sculpture, poetry reflected an effort to recapture classical values. What I think is happening in the present, and by the present I mean the whole 20th century, is a similar thing, a similar culture crisis, but on a much grander and more global and more threatening scale, and a casting back for a previous cultural model whose ideals, if we could realize them, would save our own civilization. The same idea that the Renaissance had about classical Greece. But strangely, the period that we have decided, that we have fastened on, without ever making a conscious decision, but as a reflection of decisions made in the mass psyche of the species, the period that we have settled on is the archaic period, which precedes human history. And so Cubism and the things that were done for literature by Joyce and Pound, and the glorification of barbarism and the recovery of the unconscious, first the sexual nature of the unconscious through Freud, later the mass archetypal structure through Jung. In other words, the great movements of the 20th century, even Marxism, can be seen as efforts to recapture prehistoric sacral values. And this process has been going on for 50 years or so, different adumbrations of it at different times. And now, and for the past 10 years or so, the theme of shamanism, the rediscovery of Paleolithic religion, and the rise of the use of hallucinogenic drugs, which were the driving force of Paleolithic religion, has come into the fore. Well, okay, holding that in your mind for a moment, recall Marshall McLuhan's idea that technologies for conveying information shift ratios in the mass psyche and the way that it relates to the world. And he was famous for predicting what he called electronic feudalism. He said that the television screen was more like a page of manuscript than a page of print, and that as the linearity and uniformity and rational assumptions of grammar were transcended in the conveying of information, to be replaced by electronic gestalts that were looked at rather than read, that the ratios between the senses would shift, and that this would have profound effects on art and the history of ideas and this sort of thing. What is happening is that a kind of super McLuhanistic phenomenon is happening, where we are collapsing not into the electronic feudalism that he discussed, but into the electronic tribalism which he discussed. And it is shifting our sensory ratios away from the audio and toward the visual. And this brings me now to my subject, which is the transformations of language under the influence of the psychedelic experience. The fact that there is a spectrum of vocal and psychological and psychomental phenomena that range all the way from the recitation of learned material through freely formed speech and into these trance-like religious phenomena that go under the category glossolalia. And these things are experienced by the people who do them as having a varying relationship to the visual rather than the audio sense. We had a discussion a couple of nights ago with Ralph Abraham about when you are asked to conjure the idea of an orange, what is this idea made out of? And when you close your eyes and think of an orange, is what you think of made of language, or is it made of light? And what you say in answer to this question, what does it say about you and your the way in which you're embedded in your culture? Under the influence of psilocybin, particularly, the language-forming centers are activated, and they are activated in tandem with the visual cortex, so that forms of synesthesia are experienced, which are linked, first of all, to sound, so that people singing control the fabric of hallucination through sound. And we found this to be true of ayahuasca in the Amazon, where definitely the shaman's use of voice controls the fabric, the visual fabric of what's going on. But there is yet another level to that phenomenon, which is with the addition of meaning, the control of the visual surface, the topology of meaning, if you will, rather than the ongoing decoding from a dictionary, is transcended. Meaning then is able also to work its adumbrations on this topological surface, and you see into well, there are different ways of cognizing it. The place where the Ursprach is coming from, the assembly language that lies behind all formalized or culturally validated languages. Wittgenstein called it the unspeakable. It's the place where explication cannot go almost by definition in order to avoid a tautology. Well, now it seemed to me that the nearness of these tryptamine hallucinogens to normal metabolites of brain chemistry and the fragileness that people like McLuhan and Julian Jaynes have shown to be a part of the way we construct our world. In other words, that it's a delicate balance of chemistry and language and history and these sensory ratios. That given all this, it seemed probable to me that this phenomenon encountered in deep psychedelic experiences with psilocybin actually has a potential historical impact. It is a kind of human ability which is at present submerged in the psyche, contactable only by the shamanic means of journeying into historical hyperspace. In other words, of going into that place where the adumbrations of the future are intense enough that you can have an intimation, at least, of what is to come. And I think this is what is to come, and it is a kind of telepathy, but it's not telepathy as we imagined it to be. When I imagined telepathy, I thought of it as hearing another person think and having them hear you think. This is something where the modality of meaning is shifted out of the common dictionary that is a cultural convention and into a shared visual topology which is examined by both parties, both the speaker who caused this thing to be and the audience who shares the space where this is happening. It's interesting that beta-carbolines, which are used to accentuate the hallucinogenic effect of DMT in these ayahuasca preparations in Amazonas, is very definitely a part of normal human metabolism, brain metabolism. And the MAO inhibition that it's performing on DMT that is introduced from the outside is a mirror image of the kind of function that it's performing in the brain. So the shifting of these sensory ratios is causing language to become more visual. And at this point I always have to quote Philo Judaeus, who was a first century Alexandrian Jew who talked about the logos, and I have made analogies between the phenomenon I'm describing and the logos, but in the critical quote, what he said was that a more perfect logos was possible, and that it would be a phenomenon which would pass from the modality of being heard to the modality of being beheld without ever crossing through a quantized point of transition where you could say it was one, now it is the other. And I think the cultural shock waves that will be generated by the emergence of visible language will totally transform the culture to the point that the point beyond the end of history, the entry into hyperspace, the eschatological monad, all these religious or theological constructs about history are actually intuitions about language undergoing this transformation. Now, several things about this transformation. It's obviously not something which the culture is doing as a decision. It isn't like home computers and cable TV. It isn't being brought on as an information utility. It's something which is being imposed from outside. And I think it is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Gaia or Gaia hypothesis of homeostatic regulation of the environment of the Earth through the interaction of all life acting as a single organism.
The same amount of time as the last one. 15 minutes remain to do left arm.
Trigger species such as we are.
I think I did them in the exact same way.
Part of this homeostatic method of
That
regulation.
makes sense for a finger placement,
and I
but
think
still.
the gradual evolution of language is actually the gradual lifting of the veil that is imposed between ourselves and meaning by the planetary ecology. In other words, the forward thrust of history is actually regulated by the ecology, and it is regulated through control of the evolution of language, because what you cannot think, you cannot do, and where you cannot imagine, you cannot steer your culture and go. So I'm proposing on one level that hallucinogens be thought of as human macro, almost social pheromones that regulate the rate at which language develops and therefore regulate the evolution of human culture generally. Now, one final thought about all this. It seems clear to me, and I've mentioned it in the other lectures, that the evolution, that another aspect of what psychedelics are doing and an aspect of what's happening to the culture generally is its transformation into a space-faring species, and that the momentum for this has been building for millennia. It is not something that was decided in the 1950s. It is in fact what we're all about. I looked at a book recently by Terry Wilson about Brian Geisen called Here to Go. And he asked the question, what are we here for? And he answers himself, we're here to go. And I think there's great truth in that, especially in the current historical moment where it's clear that man as a species and the planet as a unified ecosystem have become antagonistic to each other. And this is not unusual in nature. In fact, it's a phenomenon that occurs between a mother and a fetus. When the fetus comes to term, when the birth is imminent, it must happen. Otherwise, the survival of both parties is threatened, even though the birth trauma for the mother and the child represents one of the major crises that they will face in their sojourn in existence. Nevertheless, it is inevitable and necessary, and if it comes off correctly, why, it's to the good of everyone. Where psychedelics comes together with that is that it is going to require a transformation of human language and understanding to stop the momentum of the historical process, to halt nuclear proliferation, germ warfare, infantile 19th century politics, all these things. It cannot be accomplished through
All right. Well,
physical
that gets him
assault
reordered
upon it by
pretty
political
cleanly.
means. And the I Ching says, you never confront evil directly.
Without
because
diminishing
it is
the
named,
demon
it
on
sharpens
his right
its weapons and
side's
it learns
arm,
to defend
which is
itself.
pretty delicate.
So what
So
is
that's
called for
cool.
is this sideways attack through
And
hyperspace.
now I
God
think
forbid, I think it was
I'm going to reinforce the yellow. And after that, I might just let it be today. I reorganized the whole place, cleaned everything up, got the walls repositioned with new paintings, and
the
I'm a little tired today. So I might just hang out for a little while until 6 and
that this nostalgia for the archaic
watch paint
world
dry.
is coming to a head.
But
This
before
is its
that, I think I would like to get the
culmination.
yellow
This is the peculiar
reglazed.
thing that we
So
all
I'm going to mix up
sense
some
is
yellow
coming
glaze and I'll be
from
back in a moment.
Choose, which will then send the Mayan
Okay,
tribes
take
to
3.
the stars. If it had not been for this historical episode, we would essentially be at the Amazonian level of culture, which is suspended in the hallucinogenic dream, but oblivious to the historical forces which are bearing down on that. And tribalism is a social form which can exist at any level of technology. It's a complete illusion to associate it with low levels of technology. It is probably, in fact, a form of social organization second only to the family in its ability to endure. So, this must seem very strange to some people and homegrown to other people. Are there any questions at this point? Mary Matthew. Yes. Well, I think it's an attitude toward genes and property and information. The institutional, hierarchically structured societies that we associate with our own culture, which I assume we define consciously or unconsciously as somehow the superior culture, is just inherited from tribal organization, but with a need to abstract the leadership quality so that control could function over wide areas. But electronics actually is, the entire human community is enclosed in a light setting of travel. So the globalism is real. I mean, when I first read McLuhan, it seemed to me very true, but a thin voice crying in the wilderness. It was hard to see if out of all the trends working in society, that was how it would come to be. But it certainly seems to be so. I think, well, it's as H.G. Wells said, history is a race between education and disaster. And I think, that education was losing that race until electronics came along. And now I would probably be optimistic. I think that there is a global commonality of understanding coming into being, and it is not necessarily fostered by institutions. For instance, the invention of the microchip, which makes possible the personal computer, it was actually thought to be a mistake. It was not fast enough for the Defense Department purposes that it was engineered, that the research project that produced it was aiming for. And they produced instead this weird thing which they couldn't imagine what to do with because it was too slow for any military or industrial application. But someone realized, that it was just fine for human beings. and that it would shift the pieces around on the board in the war between freedom and oligarchy and human individuality and all these forces which seek to oppress it. So I don't believe that the historical process is under the control of any of the many, many institutions that we wish to control it. The break between nature and man has been overstressed, I think, and that we should realize, that we are very strange, but you can find very odd adaptations at many levels. And when you look at the global ecology, you see that there must be a species like us, or otherwise it would mean that evolution gives up at the planetary level, that somehow when it encounters the edge of the atmosphere, it just says, okay, well that's it. If the star goes, we all go, and there's no way around that. But actually, the obvious way around that is a technical species, a minded species that will open a hole using energy and understanding through which everything could escape if it had to. Because as the data flows back from these probes moving up through the solar system and beyond, it turns out that the 19th century intuition of catastrophism was very correct, that the universe is in fact a very turbulent place, and that you only have to open your time window a little bit, like 100,000 years, for the probability of very turbulent events that a global ecosystem would react to, and the strategies have to be evolved. And Francis Crick has come out with his belief, the panspermia idea, that life actually evolves in a deep space environment and is conveyed then to planetary environments where it can adapt and evolve evolutionary strategies by cometary material. At one point, we suggested that Stropharia cubensis, the psilocybin mushroom, was actually an intelligent species whose method, whose strategy of evolutionary advance was the spore, which could actually go into a kind of suspended animation for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and by that means radiate through the galaxy over very long periods of time. And that seemed like a very radical idea at the time. We hypothesized that spore liberation by an agaricus on the planetary surface, then through Brownian motion and accumulation of global charge on the surface of the spore, that there would be a small number of these tending to percolate out of any given atmosphere. And given the enormous amounts of spores that are released, you can make an argument for this kind of evolutionary strategy. But Crick, who discovered DNA, makes a much wilder hypothesis, which is that you don't even require a planetary ecosystem for DNA and life chemistry to evolve, that it can evolve in ultra-cold regimens in interstellar space and then be conveyed to various planetary chemical regimens where it can respond and grow. And
all right.
all of these things, life,
that's a decent step for the day, on top of getting stuff organized and fixed up a little bit. Sorry to hand over the place. Or have I, since I fixed shit? You know what? I'm going to take some pictures and focus on the painting for the moment.
It's not an ephemeral process in an entropic
Alright, so that gets the yellow
light is a
reinforced, a
process
little more globular in the
that,
center, cutting a
has
little bit more
duration
cleanly at
that
the edges
exceeds that
of the plane being ruptured.
star
I'll
light.
reinforce the white
And
glowing in
light's
the middle of each of those
strategy for running against
negative
the second
spaces.
law of thermodynamics
And that gets these two
expanding and
figures
conserving ordered
much more
structure
cleanly
over
placed and
vast periods
reinforced.
of time is a strategy of encoding information and retaining it. In other words,
That's it. I'm going to bask in a clean place and watch paint dry for the rest of the day. Have a good 4th of July, everyone who's celebrating, and drive safely
or coconuts or
to all of
scratches
you
on
folks
clay or
out
whatever.
there. Have a good night, Earth.